will always give credit where credit is due, and I will always allow people grace to be able to come back to the light, to be able to realize the error of their ways and say, hey, I've had a change of heart. Here's why. And I think we have to allow people to do that, or else nothing is going to be able to improve. And that is, I think, the change of heart that a Democratic state representative is having. And she wrote about it in an op-ed for the Seattle Times. This segment is brought to you in partnership with our friends at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. Make sure you sign up for their newsletter to be alerted to opportunities to do just that. All right, so the state rep in question is Rep. Lauren Davis. She's a Democrat who represents the Shoreline area. And over the last couple years, I have seen her kind of come back towards sanity a little bit and start to make, public statements about the crime crisis and things that concern her. And so she's sort of been on my radar as one of these state Democrats who's willing to go against the grain. But she acknowledges that it hasn't always been that way, and she kind of wishes that she could take some things back. She wrote this op-ed in the Seattle Times. Lawmaker, how my missteps fueled juvenile violence. So I want to go through really, there's so many things in here that she kind of acknowledges were wrong and that the legislature should go back and fix. And I want to go through a few of them. But she starts the piece by saying, in the past year, I've sat with weeping mothers, constituents of mine, whose children were slain by fellow teenagers. Juvenile arrests in Linwood, a city in my legislative district, have nearly tripled from 130 in 2022 to 355 in 2024. During these heartbreaking meetings, I find myself racked with guilt. I am culpable, she says. So she goes on to talk about a few reasons she thinks that we're having a juvenile crime crisis. Now, I agree with most of what she says in here. There are a few things that she points to, like COVID-19, that I don't think you can blame this on COVID-19. She also talks on the top here about education. She says, in analyzing the causal factors in the epidemic of juvenile violence, the first contributor is the legislature's abject failure to fully fund K-12 education. She says at least 40% of youth on probation qualify for special ed, which has been sorely under-resourced. Positions that offer early intervention have been cut. One of my school districts had to lay off 13 family advocates and 2 drug and alcohol counselors. Now, I agree with her on the notion that special ed is underfunded. I do not agree with her on the notion that we have not fully funded K-12 education. There was a mandate that the state do so. The state spends more money on K-12 education than it ever has before. The real problem is they're not focusing on the right things. So then she gets into these steps that the state legislature has taken that has to do with kind of this broader theme that we've been experiencing across the country that was tied to race and social justice, which is we can't punish kids. We can't hold kids accountable for their conduct. We can't do that because that's racist. And that's sort of this theme that after 2020 really started to set into the school environment. She said, youth entangled in our juvenile legal system are often in the grips of mental health and substance use challenges. Under Washington state law, youth 13 and older can refuse behavioral health treatment. Parents keenly aware that their children are unwell are rendered helpless. The legislature attempted to remedy this, but the measure fell short. So glad she acknowledges there that parents are helpless to help their kids in these situations because the state and Democrats have taken away the ability of parents to be involved in their child's medical care. She goes on to say, Washington's top referral source for youth addiction treatment used to be schools. Typically, a student would be suspended for a substance-related violation and required to get a substance use disorder assessment and comply with treatment before returning to school. But she says the legislature barred this practice, resulting in a massive decline in treatment admissions for adolescents battling addiction. What she's talking about there is so important. And for those of us with common sense, we knew that those steps would lead to that. We knew that giving kids 13 and over, basically carte blanche to get the medical care or not get the medical care that they choose was going to be problematic. Cutting parents out of their kids' lives is never a good idea. Acting like wholesale, even with no evidence of abuse or neglect, parents can't be trusted to make medical decisions with their kids is absolutely ridiculous. So you've got a kid who can decide totally on their own after 13 whether they need medical or mental health treatment or substance abuse treatment, and the parents, as she points out, are left and rendered helpless. So it's this whole environment of, oh, it's okay, kids, you do whatever you want, and then you decide what the consequences will be, and you decide what the remedy will be. She goes on to say, during my first legislative session in 2019, I voted for Senate Bill 5290, which prohibited juvenile detention as a sanction for status offenses like truancy. She says, I distinctly remember the floor debate. My Republican colleagues passionately argued that we should not remove juvenile detention as an option until we build up a statewide network of residential crisis centers as an alternative. They were right. I mean, this is really a stunning level of self-awareness from a state Democratic lawmaker. To say, she says, overnight after this was passed, court orders related to truancy and at-risk youth petitions became unenforceable. We tied the hands of schools, parents, and courts and removed a crucial tool to get children help before they commit a crime. And I would say, well, duh. But I'm okay 6 years later with her making that realization and being honest and reflective of it. We've talked about this on the show before with like Bob Ferguson, and I think that in the next couple years, the tides will change on some of these controversial issues like no boys and girls sports and things like that. And I said what'll probably happen is you'll have a whole slew of Democrats who say, oh, I felt that way the whole time, and will never acknowledge that they made a mistake. And they'll just try to move forward and pretend like nothing ever happened. And the same with Bob Ferguson on failing to call out, political violence from the left. And then all of a sudden he's running for governor and he's acting like he's always been against political violence. This is not that. This is someone who is saying, I was wrong. Here is excruciating detail of all the votes I took that were wrong and the consequences that those votes now had. That's leadership. I probably still don't agree with her on a ton of things, but I will never question that she has the true markers of a leader. She goes on to say, in 2021, another example, I voted for HB 1140, which in effect bars law enforcement from interviewing juvenile suspects, including those under investigation for serious crimes such as rape and murder. I thought I was voting to protect juveniles, but in actuality, juvenile assailants became protected at the expense of juvenile victims. This legislation has significantly impeded law enforcement investigations, resulting in the denial of justice for victims and a missed opportunity for intervention with juveniles engaged in escalating criminal conduct. Could not agree more. And that seems to be a common theme that Democrats have pursued, is protecting criminals at the expense of all victims, even if those victims are themselves people of color. Even if those victims are themselves juveniles. So they never look at the victim side of it. So you could say, oh, the criminal justice system disproportionately impacts people of color, so we need lower sentencing enhancements and give them opportunities for early release. And they ignore the fact that a lot of the suspects of color had victims of color. So what about justice for them? And the same thing on the juvenile crime crisis. When it comes to these young kids that are in gangs and committing acts of gang violence with firearms, today's shooter is tomorrow's victim. They're out there just shooting other kids. So if you're looking at, let's say 2 16-year-olds, and who should the criminal justice system be on the side of, the 16-year-old shooter or the 16-year-old victim, the scales should probably tip to the 16-year-old victim, don't you think? And that is what State Representative Lauren Davis is saying here, and that she's now come to the conclusion, after being in this room with her constituents, mothers who've had, their young children killed, that she was wrong. And she goes on to end the op-ed by saying, basically, we contribute to those problems, but we're not powerless to fix them. And so I pray that that sentiment can be passed on to her fellow state lawmakers. I am not going to hold my breath, but I think she is owed a tremendous amount of gratitude and credit for being able and willing to do something that's very hard, and that's admit you were wrong. It is the worst thing in the world to have to do, to admit you were wrong. But I don't think that you can be truly trustworthy and you can be a true leader until you can do that, because we all make mistakes, right? Her mistakes might have had consequences that were more severe than an average person's mistake, but admitting that mistake is the first part of moving forward. That segment is brought to you in partnership with our friends at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. Make sure you sign up for their newsletter to be alerted to opportunities to do just that. Future42.org.